Dr. Rajani Katta, author of the Medical School Interview book and the MMI book. And if you're preparing for the CASPer exam, then you know how challenging it can be. And that's because the CASPer exam is known as a situational judgment exam. And so they present you with a challenging scenario, and then they ask you 3 different questions about that scenario. Now, you could have potentially infinite number of challenging scenarios, but if you look at the questions that are asked, they tend to fall into 5 main categories. There are some questions that are going to fall out of those 5 main categories, but in general, I think of them as falling into these 5 main categories. And so in this series, I wanted to present you with a few strategies and tips on how to approach these types of questions. So this is our series on dissecting CASPer test questions. One of the most common types of questions that you'll be asked is the situational judgment question. So this is where you're presented with a scenario, a challenging scenario, and you are asked, how would you react or how would you respond in this given situation? So this really focuses on the micro level interactions between individuals. So let me give you an example scenario. You work the early shift at a coffee shop, and you have 2 workers, Mary and Matthew. Mary's been really frustrated because Matthew has been chronically late to work. She says that that's not fair because that means that you and she have to do extra work because of that. She really wants to go to Matthew and really discuss her frustrations with him and complain to him. What would you advise Mary to do? So this is an example of a situational judgment question. What do you advise her to do? And again, in later videos in the scenario, I'm going to break down some frameworks that I've developed for some of these types of questions. So for example, for situational judgment questions, I recommend the I3P approach, and that'll be in a later video. But this is an example of a situational judgment question. What would you do in this particular scenario? Reform questions talk about how you would make improvements or reforms. So for example, in the coffee shop where you work, what changes might you suggest to your manager in order to improve the workplace? So these are questions where they're asking you about maybe changing practices or developing policies or adjusting expectations in order to prevent situations from occurring, or in order to better handle certain situations, or to better respond to situations. Now these questions might be more macro level interactions. So for example, how would you change the visitor policy at a hospital in order to prevent visitor complaints? Or it might be very specific to a particular setting. So what could you do in the coffee shop to prevent these kind of conflicts from occurring in the future? But this is what we call reform questions. And sometimes it's about developing a new policy, or sometimes it's about responding to a particular situation. But if you're asked to develop a policy, or if you have that opportunity to develop a policy, this is where I talk about the IGT framework, where you bring in information, goals, and tying it back to the scenario in order to present a response to this kind of reform question. So again, we're going to dissect reform questions a little bit later. Another category of questions is what I call personal questions. Now these are questions that ask for your personal perspective on general principles or issues related to this particular scenario. So for example, in the coffee shop scenario, one of the questions might be, in your opinion, what are the qualities that make for a good teammate? So again, this is asking for your personal perspective on just an issue or an area that's related to the particular scenario. Another category of questions that you're very likely to encounter on the CASPer exam is behavioral interview questions. Now you might be familiar with behavioral interview questions from other interview settings. So they might be used in the traditional medical school interview. They're often used in the MMI. And behavioral interview questions have been frequently used in the business world, and they're becoming increasingly used in other professional settings, but they are based upon the belief that past behavior helps to predict future behavior. So these are questions that ask about how you have handled past situation. So for example, with a behavioral interview question related to the coffee shop scenario, tell me about a time when you experienced an unfair distribution in your workload. How did you handle it? So one of the clues that you're dealing with a behavioral interview question is when you hear those words, tell me about a time when. And again, that's bringing up a past situation that you've dealt with, and then you're asked to describe it. And the typical framework that's classically used for behavioral interview questions is the STAR approach, STAR approach, combined with lessons learned. So we'll talk a lot more about that in a future video on behavioral interview questions. The fifth and final category of questions is what I call the big questions. And these are very challenging, often because they are broad in scope and they can be really profound. And you're asked to answer these big questions in maybe 90 seconds. So something related to the coffee shop scenario might be, in your opinion, why are some teams so great? So you can imagine how that's challenging because you've got 90 seconds to type out a response, but that's what I call the big questions. So that's the general overview of the types of questions that you might encounter on a CASPer exam. Again, this is a broad category and there might be other questions, but in general I find that they fall into these 5 main types. So if you continue into the other videos in the scenario, you'll see us dissect a little bit deeper into the specifics on how to answer some specific types of questions. And as I mentioned, I'll go deeper into the I3P approach, the IGT approach, and then the STAR approach. We also have some links in the video description if you want to see links to some of our blog posts. And we have a 6-part series blog post about preparing for the CASPer exam. So we will link to that in the video description. So if you're taking the CASPer exam this year, I wish you all the best. It can be very challenging, but with preparation and a little bit of practice, I know that you'll do well. All the best to you.